Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening and for choosing to spend a part of your evening with us. My name is Brad Martin. I'm the president of the board of directors for the BC Bereavement Helpline. On behalf of everyone at the BCBH, I'd like to thank you for being here. Tonight's webinar is part of our Punjabi Grief Initiative, which aims to make grief education and support more culturally familiar, accessible, and responsive for the Punjabi and South Asian communities across British Columbia. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the BC Bereavement Helpline gathers and works on the ancestral, traditional, and unceded lands of the Coast Salish peoples, including the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I'd also like everyone to share in the chat where you're joining us from this evening. It's always nice to see where people are joining from in the communities across British Columbia and beyond. I'd like to share a few housekeeping reminders also. Some of the conversations we'll be having this evening may feel emotional or bring up personal experiences of grief. Please take care of yourself throughout the webinar. Feel free to step away at any time. Grab some water or tea, take some deep breaths, do whatever helps to help you stay grounded. This session is being recorded for educational purposes and may be uploaded to the BC Bereavement Helpline YouTube channel. If you're more comfortable keeping your camera off, you're very welcome to do so. And please use the chat throughout the presentation if you have questions. We'll do our best to address them during the Q&A at the end of the webinar, time permitting. We'll also ask that everyone help us create a respectful and compassionate space by communicating with kindness, recognizing that everyone joins us with different experiences of grief and loss. At the end of tonight's webinar, we'll share a brief feedback survey. Your feedback helps us improve future webinars and continue developing programs and resources throughout our Punjabi Grief Initiative. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening, Meena Bolla Singh. Meena is a registered social worker and clinical team lead at Strength Counseling Services. She completed her Master of Social Work at the University of British Columbia and has dedicated her career to supporting individuals, couples, and families navigating grief, trauma, complex mental health challenges. Early in her career, Meena worked in acute healthcare, including the intensive care unit during both the opioid crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic. Those experiences gave her a profound understanding of the many ways grief can affect individuals, families, and communities. As a first-generation Punjabi Canadian, Meena also brings valuable lived experience to her work. She is passionate about providing culturally responsive, trauma-informed care and believes that meaningful grief support begins with understanding the cultural, family, and community contexts that shape how people experience loss. This evening, she'll be sharing insights on understanding grief in South Asian communities, culture, connection, and support, exploring how culture, identity, spirituality, migration, and community influence grief, how we can provide support that is compassionate, culturally informed, and responsive. Meena, thank you so much for being with us this evening. I'll turn the webinar over to you.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome, Brad. Hi, everyone. My name is Meena Bolla Singh, and I'm very excited to be here today. Today's webinar is not just important to me because of my lived experience as a South Asian with grief, but because of some of the professional experience that you heard Brad describe about my background. So that is all going to be shaping and grounding the frameworks that I'm going to be talking about with you all today. So please know that the topics we'll be talking about are quite sensitive in nature. So I encourage you to do what you need to do to practice self-care. If that means stepping away, taking a break, please do what that means. The two things I ask of you is that you limit yourself from sharing anything that might be confidential about someone in your family or in your community, and that you hold everything that you're learning here with some openness. So, what you can expect today is conversations about what grief is. Of course, we're going to go over cultural considerations, hence why we're all here today. And I'm going to be reviewing supportive ways that you can show up for someone who's going through grief, practical tools and language that you can walk away with. And we will be going into a Q&A period as well. So let's talk about why this webinar matters. Well, to start with, it's the population in Canada. So South Asians make up the largest racialized group in Canada. That's roughly 2.6 million people, approximately 7.1% of the population. In terms of BC specifically, Punjabi happens to be the #1 non-official language spoken in most homes in BC. That's roughly 222,000. And we understand statistically that South Asians with major depression are 85% less likely to seek treatment in comparison to other Canadians. So while we know that culturally adapted care is important, it's necessary, it's effective, very few culturally adapted programs have actually been evaluated and implemented, hence the gap that we see here today. So as we talk about South Asians today, please know that we absolutely cannot generalize them because South Asian is not a monolith. It encompasses over 20 countries, dozens of languages, multiple religions. So although we'll be talking about patterns today and I might be sharing my observations, please refrain from stereotyping. That means that we're going to have to follow each person as a unique expert of their own experience. Our role is to listen, to learn, to follow their lead, and to hopefully build some awareness about helpful language that we can use. So let's talk about grief and what we know about it. Well, we understand that grief is completely natural and a normal response to loss. It's nothing to be pathologized. It's an intense emotional or a natural reaction to a loss. It often tends to get associated with the death of a person or a pet, but it has a lot more to do with that. It can encompass anything significant to someone, such as a change that happened. So some examples of loss that you see here on the slide are when is the death of a person or a being, and some types of losses that might be more relevant to immigrant communities, such as South Asians, like the loss of a homeland or identity, language, or role. More examples of losses include the loss of a relationship, the loss of a health status, the loss of a job or a career, a home, maybe even dreams and aspirations for the future, or a sense of independence. Disenfranchised grief, though, this is a loss that is not or cannot be openly validated or publicly mourned or socially supported. We tend to see disenfranchised grief with more stigmatized losses, like the loss of death by suicide or toxic drug overdose, or loss because of a health condition that is stigmatizing in itself, like HIV or AIDS. Disenfranchised grief also shows up for unrecognized relationships. So you can consider this to be when there's a death of an ex-spouse, the death of someone that was an abuser to you that you've gone no contact with, the death of a casual partner or a queer partner that was not necessarily open. Disenfranchised grief can also include non-death losses, some which we talked about, like a job or a health. And disenfranchised grief also includes hidden losses, which could be miscarriages, fertility challenges, or an abortion. Anticipatory losses, though, this is the anticipatory grief of having an emotional sorrow or a sense of loss before the impending death or change has actually happened. You can consider this to be when you're grieving future events that you won't get to share, like birthdays or graduations or day-to-day moments that are just easy experiences. You're mourning the person or a place or a thing while you're still sharing moments with them, and it might mimic symptoms and signs of grief. I'm sure many of us can relate to the experience of anticipatory grief. Secondary losses, you can consider this to be the ripple effect of a primary loss. Secondary losses tend to be less obvious and less anticipated, but they tend to hold just as much weight as the primary loss in itself. So, for example, finances is a major secondary loss. If you think about a spouse who would have passed away and they were the sole breadwinner, they were who was relied upon for the pension or the assets. If they were to die, then suddenly that's a lot of financial precarity for the bereaved. If they didn't manage any of their assets, in that they didn't do any legal advanced care planning, they didn't have a will, they didn't appoint an executor of their will, all these unmanaged assets and the legal complications that ensue as a result of it is a practical secondary loss that someone would be feeling. Relationship ruptures are also a major secondary loss. And it is likely that relationship disputes could be happening, ruptures because of disputes about inheritance or caregiving decisions, or just generally a differing style in grief. And that's really significant because community is a major part for how grief can be realized. And relationship ruptures can really impact someone's grief experience. And then identity and role can also be a major secondary loss, in that someone might be questioning the narrative of who they are. What am I outside of my this and what I used to consider myself to be? Maybe they're losing a social standing that they had in their community. So throughout this webinar, you'll be noticing text boxes in blue at the bottom, and that's for those of us who have the opportunity to provide support to South Asians who are grieving. And it'll be things to nudge you and prompt you to think about. And what I invite you to think about is asking questions of what else has changed since the death. And if you are noticing secondary losses, that you openly talk about them and name them, because they tend to be quite invisible. So let's talk about what we know and understand about how grief can show up. Well, we know that our emotions can range and pendulate all over the place. Some of us might be familiar with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief model: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. But we know that the stages of grief are not linear and that one could be pendulating all over the place in terms of how they're feeling. When I was working in the ICU, one emotional experience of grief that I noticed often was denial. And denial I noticed to be the most common when the cause of death was a brain death, which does require extensive testing. So the ways I would see denial might be in the family reactions of, but their temperature is still warm when I touch them, or their chest is still rising and falling, even though that's because of the life support. Or I saw them move, I know they're there, even though those might have been involuntary movements because of the brain death. So after a person is declared brain dead, that actually becomes the official time of death for them. And the team would then have to have difficult conversations with the family about what the next steps will be. And usually it's either deciding between liberating the patient from life support measures or deciding whether organ donation is something that the family wants or the patient would have qualified for. And this is when I would see anger be quite prominent for families. They might have anger towards the team for even insinuating that their loved one is dead, or denial that you don't understand what God's plan is. Sometimes their spiritual connection would strengthen and their tension with the Western medicine might increase. But there's a real risk of spiritual exploitation during this time because it's a very vulnerable time for families. Maybe the spiritual connection that they're turning towards is exploiting them and suggesting that they donate money or that they do rituals. And so families end up donating money that they don't have and doing rituals that they don't have time for or understand. Denial can be so strong for some families that it even guides their decision making and starts decentering the patient. They might say things like, keep them on life support until X person comes with their visa, or just do anything you can, whether that means it's an intrusive medical intervention, because I just need this person to be alive no matter what you do. And that gets really ethically challenging for the medical team to navigate and can even cause some disputes within the family. It's also possible that someone might be at a place of acceptance in their grief and is ready to make an informed decision, but they might face backlash from the extended family members that what you're doing is giving up, you're selfish, you're not trying hard enough. Physical changes that we might notice in grief too is the changes in appetite, sleep disturbances, a lot of fatigue, tension in their body, whether that's chest tightness or muscle tension. We might also see their behaviors changing. They might withdraw socially. They might overfunction. Overfunctioning might look like them staying really busy, picking up a lot of work, picking up overtime. And it's not likely that the employer would gently tap them on their shoulder and say, hey, maybe you need to take a break and you should go home, because the value that employers have is in not being short-staffed. Maybe the person is overfunctioning and working excessively because they don't have a choice. Maybe the secondary loss was financial precarity, like we were talking about earlier. It's possible that the person's behavior might change in compulsive behaviors, what we consider as maladaptive coping. Perhaps they're turning towards a substance more. Maybe they're immersing themselves in a lot of rituals or avoiding them entirely. It's possible that someone might start feeling existential and experience some kind of questioning with their spirituality, or that they might have a spiritual awakening. But all in all, there is no right way to grieve, and timelines are varying across cultures and individuals. So, stigma is going to be a central piece of today's webinar and the conversation that we have, because stigma rears its head a lot in the South Asian community, particularly with grief. Many communities understand this line of what will people say. In the Punjabi language, it's log ki kahoge. And we'll see how stigma shows up in terms of death and dying when it begins with a stigmatized death. So if the death happened because of an overdose or a suicide or a gang-related death or intimate partner violence, these are already stigmatizing deaths in themselves, but this can often silence the grief before it can even begin in a South Asian community. Stigma can show up in that it can be stigmatizing to even talk about death or dying generally. Some communities might feel like it's superstitious or it's taboo, or we're willing it upon us by even talking about death. And this ends up resulting in some resistance to advanced care planning. And that ends up resulting in avoidance of hard conversations, hence the disputes we see later amongst family and the ruptures that we see. Stigma can also show up in that it's taboo to talk negatively about the deceased's memory. And that's really complicated for the person who had a negative experience with the deceased. Perhaps they were feeling like they were abused by the deceased, or the way that they're expressing their grief feels inauthentic and unresolved because it's not permissible for them to speak negatively. And of course, as we talked about earlier, there is a massive stigma in terms of seeking professional support. Given the statistic we were seeing of 85% of South Asians being less likely to seek support if they have depression. So getting medication or starting therapy can be seen as a sign of weakness or betrayal of a family's privacy. We also see stigma in the way that it impacts the expectations one might have and how they're supposed to grieve. So if someone's not coping well, such as they're taking too much time off work, or they're being too emotional, or they're not turning towards spirituality as it might be expected of them, that might be seen as a major failure of them. But as you can see on the bottom of the slide, coping too well is also stigmatized, in that if their self-care is in check, or the reason that their self-care is in check is because they're taking medication, they're going to therapy, they're using resources like palliative care or a caregiver, that might be seen as stigmatizing, because in some communities it's seen as an honorable act to care for your loved one and a duty to do that. So sometimes your visible suffering is a sign of love. What's also stigmatizing is grieving with boundaries. And that's because there is a community value of collectivism. And so if a family is to try to grieve with boundaries about what we welcome in terms of the information we want to share, or when we are welcoming visitors, that might be seen as disrespectful or cold to others who want to be there for them. Which is what brings us to the conversation about the period of mourning. So the period of mourning in the Punjabi language, at least, is called afsos. So, absoos is that cultural expectation when someone has died that you are showing your immediate form of support to the family by visiting them within 24 hours of the death, well into the 1 to 2 weeks after the death. It's a cultural expectation that you'll be visiting the bereaved, and this is the way that you'll be paying respect to them, offering support. And in fact, if you don't come to the bereaved's home, it's viewed as negatively and a sign of disrespect because of the value of collectivism. So while some may say that it's a beautiful thing that there's wraparound support to a family immediately upon a death, there is a duality here that there's an impact on the bereaved. The imagery you can picture here is that upon the news of death happening and information being shared with one phone call, within 24 hours, the driveway of the bereaved is immediately filling up with car. Their whole street, maybe, and dozens and dozens and dozens of people are coming in and out of the home for 2 weeks straight outside of the hours that you would sleep. And so, if you are the bereaved, you are constantly retelling the story of the death. And that's pretty re traumatizing, psychologically impactful. And if you are considering the amount of people that you are hosting in and out of your home, you have to make sure that it is a clean home, that there's enough cutlery, paper plates, enough food and refreshments to serve them. That if I'm not doing well, I might take medication because of my pain. So there's a significant expenditure of resources to host the people that are coming to Absos. There's also a hidden burden to manage other people's grief and to maintain your own composure. So if I'm at a place of acceptance about my meaning making of the death, but the people I'm retelling the story to are in absolute shock and dismay, then I have to manage that. I have to help them cope with the news that I'm hardly coping with. And of course, if you can imagine with the dozens of people that are coming in and out of your home, it is likely that you'll receive some kind of unsolicited input from a visitor. And that might reinforce some shame or some anger. This whole period of absos essentially leaves little to no time for basic self-care. So if there was something that the bereaved would say, oh, this is something that really helps me. This is a form of self-care for me. I always like to go for a walk here, or I like to do this there. Anything that would be considered rejuvenating is off the table because if it's not happening at home, it's not okay. Everyone who's coming to Absos is expecting that they'll see you when they come there. So there's an expectation for you to stay home. This all inevitably ends up in a delay or a suppression of the grief for the bereaved and can only really emerge when the community has moved on, which is usually 2 to 3 weeks after the death. So for clinicians, I encourage you to pay special attention to the absos period. The weeks of absos are the times that you're going to want to ask, are you managing your self-care? Are there gentle boundaries you could consider setting? Are there any things that you can delegate? And then you're really going to have to pay attention to the period when the support concentration just drops off, when there's no one there anymore, there's no more visitors. How is that person coping? So, as we were mentioning earlier, there are multiple religions in the South Asian community, and the purpose for bringing them up to the slide is to see that there's differing perspectives that they might have on the death and dying in the process. So, in Hinduism, we understand that there's a 13-day mourning period. There's a belief in karma and rebirth, and that the soul is moving towards liberation through rebirth. In Islam, we understand that there's a time sensitivity of a burial within 24 hours. There's typically a 3-day mourning period, and that reciting the Quran is central to mourning. In Sikhi, we understand that there's a belief in the soul's journey back to Waheguru, the creator, and that kirtan, devotional music, and ardas, prayer, are central mourning practices, and cremation is considered standard. And in Christianity, we understand that there is a belief in resurrection and eternal life, and that there's a faith in God's plan, and that mourning practices vary across denominations. So just because someone says that I'm a practicing this, it means that we should be asking them what that means to them. We shouldn't automatically be assuming that, oh, because I understand this about this religion, I assume you will be doing that during this process. So let's talk about how gender in the South Asian community may have an influence in the grief expression and in the roles. during the dying process and thereafter. So for men, we understand that South Asian men are often expected to be stoic, to manage the logistics and difficult decisions. They might be the ones to actually go to the funeral home or make the phone calls informing other people about the news of the death. They might be expected to hold it together and have all these difficult conversations. Emotional expression might even be seen as a sign of weakness. When I worked in the ICU as a social worker, at times I did notice gender playing a role in who got to be involved in hard conversations. So even if there was a male patient and their next of kin was a female spouse, the older males outside of an immediate family would often be in these family meetings to supposedly call the shots. For South Asian women, they may be expected to be the primary emotional caregivers. So that period of absoos that I was describing earlier is happening on their backs. They are the engine keeping this all going, everything on the home front and on an emotional front. And that means that they might be suppressing their own grief. For widows, we understand that they face a very particular vulnerability that often doesn't get talked about. Not only are they potentially losing social status, but they might also be losing financial security. They might have to then become reliant on extended family for their financial survival. We understand that in some South Asian cultures too, that they might even be socially excluded. Sometimes widows are barred from attending auspicious events and ceremonies. And sometimes some cultures may even have traditions that forbid certain widows from wearing jewelry or colors. For women who are widows, we understand that they might be expected to remain eternally loyal to the spouse and even caregive for their in-laws. But for men who are widows, we understand that there is less of a stigma in terms of remarriage. So for clinicians, I invite you to constantly be exploring with your clients. Who do the clients feel they're grieving for? Who do they feel like they're grieving with? What do they feel like they are allowed to grieve and by whom? So let's talk about how grief across borders and immigration and the diasporic experience impacts the grief. So for grief that's happening across borders, this is particularly difficult if there is a time zone barrier, geographical distance, if a death happened back home, someone wasn't there for the end of life, or they can't be there for the rituals. That period of absos that's very, very important to happen as a community might be something that they then have to do in their country of residence. This is something I noticed quite a bit when I was working in the ICU during COVID, and there were a lot of restrictions for travel. During that time, we were fortunate enough to get funding for iPads, and those iPads were very helpful for us to do Zoom calls and FaceTime calls for families anywhere across borders and in town. And that was a really helpful way for them to stay connected. But sometimes you're waiting for emergency visas and you're stuck, or your family is waiting for you to come, but that's inevitably delaying the end of life process. We understand that for first generation and second generation South Asians, there's also a possibility that their way of grieving might be different from their parents who immigrated here. And that might end up resulting in some family conflict. Maybe they don't understand or agree with the decisions, or they resent the rituals or the cultural expectations. Maybe they disagree with the caregiving decisions. And these can create those relational ruptures that we were talking about earlier. And then, of course, there are some practical accessibility barriers about who gets to take time off and who gets to visit. In hospitals, we have limitations about who's allowed to be a visitor. For bereavement leave, we have limitations in terms of someone has to be an immediate family member for you to even qualify for bereavement leave, which at that is really just 3 to 5 business days, which is not enough time to grieve. And not everyone qualifies for leave or can take time off. If someone works for themselves and they're self-employed, they haven't paid into EI, they might not even have the option to take time off work to focus on their grief, because that might mean they'll lose their job or their stable source of income. So intergenerational grief and intergenerational trauma is also a central piece of today's webinar. And before we talk about intergenerational experience of grief, we have to talk about what intergenerational trauma is, which is essentially the transmission of historical, psychological, or emotional distress from trauma survivors to their descendants. So an example is traumatic experiences can actually modify your gene expression. Not many people know this, but this is actually what created the field of epigenetics. So the famine, like the 1943 Bengali famine, or even the famine that happened in Ireland, any colonial related food shortage era did inevitably alter a human's metabolic pathways. So the body then adapts to really conserve sugar and fat efficiently. So because of these inherited metabolic adaptations, South Asians can store disproportionately higher amounts of visceral fat, and this ends up leading to the likelihood that they'll have higher rates of type 2 diabetes or cardiovascular diseases. So here we have it, intergenerational trauma can end up becoming a public health issue. So it is possible that some of the South Asians that you're working with are carrying grief from events that were never fully mourned and might have happened before they were even alive. Some examples of these kinds of events could include colonization, the partition for India and Pakistan, the 1984 anti-Sikh violence, the Gujarat riots, Sri Lankan civil war, Bangladesh civil war, and decades of state-sanctioned persecution. Some of these things are still happening today. They're not exactly distant memory, and the survivors of these events may very well be alive today, may be in the communities that we're serving today. And they may be feeling a type of grief that they can't put their finger on. It's like grief without a specific loss. So maybe their behavior is that they have a lot of scarcity or a lot of hypervigilance without clear threat, or a lot of guilt or shame without actually doing anything wrong. Or they're feeling a lot of grief about the ideas they had of the life they imagined if they hadn't been experiencing state sanctioned persecution. So if you think about what communities who endure violence or events like this have to do, they have no choice but to figure out how they are going to survive. And surviving really just means they have to adapt. And so in order to move through all of this, they have to really just move forward. There is no time to move through. They cannot unpack all of their pain and all of their hurt. So that might result in us seeing these communities display things like stoicism or an affinity towards using a substance or a lack of emotional expression or just working really hard and being very resilient. But these are not personality traits. They are survival strategies that might have been passed down through generations. So for clinicians who are working with South Asian clients experiencing grief, you need to consider the possibility that the primary grief that they're dealing with, it might be the first time that they have permission to freely grieve, that they feel safe to do that, and that might then open up years and years of much older pain. So let's talk about the barriers that grieving South Asians may feel in terms of seeking support. Well, for one, it's financial costs. There is a lack of free and affordable mental health services. Lots of South Asians fall in the middle class, low middle class. So they might not necessarily qualify for subsidized care, but they also can't afford private therapy. We know there's also long wait lists for doctors and therapists. So that means that the care ends up getting delayed and delayed and delayed until some kind of crisis point happens that requires an intervention to happen. We know that there's also a lack of culturally informed services. And so South Asian clients often feel a burden of having to educate their providers, and they feel limited in terms of freely talking if their provider isn't bilingual or multilingual. That really limits their options in terms of finding a provider. And we know that there's limited social supports in the community. Very few spaces exist, especially for widows, for their grief to be contained and held outside of religious institutions. So where is someone supposed to go if the faith-based support isn't enough? Or where do they go if they do not consider themselves to be religious? And even if there is a culturally informed provider with a low wait list that has a means to provide services in a reasonable budget for a client, stigma may be the thing that prevents help seeking. That person might fear community judgment. They might fear being recognized by someone or receiving services from someone they know. They might feel shameful, or family disapproval might end up preventing their help seeking. So we're going to switch gears here and talk about practical tools and language that those of us who have the opportunity to support South Asians may benefit from. I know some people here are social workers or educators or healthcare providers. So let's talk about just simply starting with your presence. Your presence can be the most powerful thing that you can show up with. A calm, grounding presence that is willing to sit in the pain, that isn't going to jump to solutions. You're going to have to ditch that part of you that wants to provide quick support, like a referral or a resource list or advice, and just start with your presence. You're also going to be mindful about honoring the rituals that are important to someone and asking them what kinds of things do they need to do and invite them to participate in them. Essentially, you're invited to be a good liaison. And when I worked with nurses in that multidisciplinary team setting, the nurses I was working with were exceptional. They were really good liaisons. Examples of that is they kept the iPads going at all times to play religious music that was important to a family or their patient. They were really good about reinforcing boundaries about which visitors are not permitted to come if that was the family's wishes. And we also worked together to create memory boxes for patients before they died. And so we would work with the family and curate things like a heartbeat strip or a patient bracelet or fingerprints of their loved one. But I invite you to validate the whole grief in all the nuanced ways that we've been talking about and understand that the grief is more than just the primary death that's in front of you. And ask the patient, ask the client, what about your other support systems? Who else should be here and isn't here? Who is around you and is silently helping you? It's important to note, though, that just because your clients are mourning in a loud way, in a communal way, or with extended periods of time, or there's a lot of spiritual explanation as to how they're making sense of the death, not all of that constitutes something that is complicated and should be pathologized. It's important that we keep our eyes on the supporters of the bereaved as well, because caregiver grief is often very invisible, but it's real. So think about the others who are there during the absolve period and helping with practical matters. And ask the family for consent of who else they would like to engage in their community that they think might be a helpful ally during their time of need. You could think about community leaders or religious figures, or maybe even someone who's an elder and they could play a parental type role to your client. Often people like this have access to wisdom and resources that are outside of our scope as providers. So it's important to have a multi-pronged, collaborative team approach in terms of supporting our client. So when you think about what I should be avoiding, it is a lot about your assumptions. So let's start with assumptions about understanding. Just because we think that we've explained something to someone, we should not automatically assume that they are comprehending that information, even if the information that you shared it in was in the primary language that that person speaks. We should also avoid relying on family to be interpreters at all costs. Not only is it completely unfair, but it's inappropriate. It compromises patient confidentiality when we're putting that burden on family members. So unless family explicitly volunteers and consents to taking on a translator role, we should take that burden off of them. We should also avoid dismissing any cultural needs just because we think it's not relevant to the person's care. And we shouldn't discredit whatever someone is saying to us is important to them in their time of grief. That being said, we should also avoid assuming that just because someone's South Asian, that they're going to be cultural and religious and have traditions that they're going to want to be involved. So again, we have to avoid homogenizing. We have to avoid making generalizations just based on identity. And we always should be asking first of, what do you need and how can I help you? And just because we asked one person in a family doesn't mean we should assume that the next person feels the same. What one person said they need today might vary in the next hour, by the end of the day, tomorrow. And so we should always be checking in and be attuned towards our clients. So it is our responsibility then to make information as accessible as possible for the people that we serve. This was really easy for me in the hospital setting because there was brochures in every kind of language. And so I would just grab and go and provide them to families. And we should also be making any accommodation to bring in professional translators, third-party translators, because family members aren't always qualified and aren't always actually prepared to do that. A case that comes to mind for me is when I worked in the oncology unit, and there was a patient who had just been diagnosed with cancer again. And as they were sharing the news, we were sharing the news with their son. He was in his own stage of grief, he was in denial. And so it was not possible for him to be a reliable translator for his mom, the patient, and share that news to her. We should also be taking on any action that will allow for cultural practices, spiritual practices to be accessible in our care setting. So, an example I'm thinking of is when I was in the ICU and we had Indigenous patients. And if doing a smudging ceremony was important to them, then all I had to do was just call the hospital engineer, ask them to turn the fire alarms off temporarily, and that would allow for the family to do what they needed to do. So again, think about anything that's within the means of your care setting that could be an accommodation for their cultural, spiritual practices. We should also be addressing the grieving person's needs head on and centering them, not jumping to problem solving, not looking away, and asking directly, what do you need right now? And if we hear something that's not in our toolkit, then it's our responsibility then to broaden our horizon and to start collaborating with other people who could be helpful teammates with us. So if you're working with a client and you're starting to get concerned that their grief is seeming to be very intense, you could consider intense to be something that's lasting longer than 12 months, impacting someone's ability to function in their day-to-day activities of living. They're completely socially withdrawing. They have an inability to accept the death. They feel suicidal. They're self-harming, constantly, persistently having suicidal ideation. Then these would be the times that you could start consulting with culturally informed clinicians with the patient's consent, of course, and see if there's an approach that you can take to support this person with multiple teammates. Again, though, a caveat is just because someone has an extended way of grieving or has an ongoing connection with the deceased, let's say it's been 33 years since the death and they're doing an annual prayer, or they talk to the deceased every single day. These things don't constitute prolonged grief disorder. So we should be assessing within a cultural context and not against it. So my hope is some key takeaways that you're all taking in are that South Asian communities are just very diverse. There is not a single grief experience. And that means that the way we show up has to be with absolute humility, never making assumptions, having a grounded, calm, open presence, a willingness to follow their lead. I hope you're also taking away the nuances of grief and that it's shaped by so many forces, like values of collectivism, like intergenerational trauma, gender, roles, stigma. And my hope is that you are invited to start naming invisible grief as well, like disenfranchised grief, secondary losses, and generational grief. So we have the opportunity now to switch gears into Q&A. I'm curious about whether there are any questions that came up for you, if there's things that resonated the most with you, whether it was on a personal level or work level, and if there's anything that's feeling challenging as well. So I'll be keeping my eye on the chat box here. and feel free to share whatever is coming up for you.
Hi. I'm not sure if you can hear me. I had my hand raised, but not sure if you're picking hands or whatever.
Yeah,
But
I can hear
thank
you.
you so much. Thank you so much for this. I really valued your experiences and the stories you shared, especially in the clinical context. I also work in a hospital, more providing spiritual care, actually. Um, so one of the questions that I had is you talked a lot about stigma. And as you know, sometimes when you're in a clinical setting, you have a whole group of family there in the room. I'm curious about how you respond when, say, one family member is expressing grief in a moment, and
Mhm.
then another family member does something that might stigmatize that grief expression. And so, as a person coming in supporting, and I'm not South Asian myself, um,
Mhm.
how how would I or how would you navigate, you know, giving space for that grief, but also acknowledging that, they might have said something that was stigmatizing and almost doing damage control in that moment while also trying to provide grief support.
Mm, that's a really good question. Yeah. I think this is probably where your clinical expertise, like your finger on the pulse, is really going to be important here. So if you're feeling like a felt sense to do damage control of maybe just even making like a comment like it's okay, like it's all good, or you might be looking around and there might be a room, like a family room that you can kind of usher the person who's having a hard time to go to, or invite the person who's making a lot of unwanted comments to consider going to. That might be something you might have to do, right? Is just kind of grounding, taking control, and making sure that the person who's having a big grief expression isn't being decentered.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I see one question here by Anisha. Do we have anything to elaborate on in regards to working with children? Really good question. So actually, when we were working in the ICU, we had a very different framework for working with children and talking about death and dying with them, especially if we had to um, if the family did consent to the children being there before end of life, right? Sometimes though, on speaking about denial, sometimes though, some families felt like, no, we don't want to bring the kids into the conversation. They're too young for this. They don't understand, even though the children were adolescents. And so sometimes I would have to kind of gently press them a little bit about what might be in the best interest of the child, right? And what might be harmful to that child is the trauma of not being able to be there for end of life. And so, see if there's any resources in the setting that you work in. And if you are dealing with conversations about death and dying in an acute setting and don't have resources, you might need to create them. But they do exist out there, and you might want to consider networking amongst other agencies. So, if you're in one health authority, maybe you could consider networking with another one to see what they have out there. Okay, I'm seeing another question here. How about organ donation? Are South Asians open to it, or do we need to avoid talking about organ donation to South Asian family members? I think that you should not avoid talking about organ donation because all families and all patients have the right to this conversation. And I don't think I could generalize that South Asians are avoidant to it or open to it because, again, some communities might have a belief that all organs must be intact at the time of cremation or at the time of burial, right? It also could be possible that the patient did have an advance directive and did want to be an organ donor, but then the family doesn't want that to happen, and they have the right to either have that materialize or not. So I do encourage you to do what is standard practice, right? And just to hold space for any family, whether they're South Asian or not, to answer their questions and to make sure that they feel informed and educated. Because for some families, doing organ donation feels like a gift that keeps on giving for them and a way for them to make sense. I'm seeing one question here. How would I recommend working with anticipatory grief within the community as preparing families for scenarios or even discussing it can be seen as yeah, taboo for calling bad events. I think you could just start off by being very practical, right? Very matter of fact. So one thing I didn't mention is a resource that we use in hospitals. It's called the My Voice booklet. So social workers here are already familiar with it. It's an awesome workbook. It's made in many languages. There's pages of this is what it means to appoint a substitute decision maker for your health, and this is what a advanced directive means. Do you want to experience resuscitation or this or that, right? And so I would say continue to do your education, persist on doing your education no matter what. And just because a family is feeling like avoidant or no thank you, then just go ahead and respect that. Don't push beyond what they've consented to, but go ahead and document what your efforts were. So you can say that I did make an, writer provided psychoeducation on this and that. Family is aware of the resources and was offered the material, right? But beyond that, I would encourage you to respect what the family's limits are. But as a clinician, you can plant seeds, right? You can keep planting seeds, and that's a really valuable thing that you can do. As I'm reading, if anyone has their hands up, feel free to go ahead and unmute as well. I see one question. Do I find that South Asians can give too much authority to the medical staff, such as they know best? Um, I think it is possible that some South Asian communities might. It's dependent, though, in terms of literacy and education. I do think, generally speaking, that we are all, I mean, all of us in society are socialized to put a lot of value on people in authority figures, right? Whether that's doctors or lawyers or this or that. And I think it is important to inform the families that they have a right to always ask for a second opinion, right? Again, it's about knowledge and literacy. And so if they feel like they would like more knowledge, that's all good. Uma, I see you have your hand up. Go ahead and unmute if you would like to.
Yeah, this is a great presentation. Thank you.
Thank
Um,
you.
uh, yeah, one of the questions was just about kind of I think as a South Asian, understanding all these levels of grief that you're suppressing or that you are code switching or that you're figuring out like, okay, this is what you say to auntie, this is what you say to your grandparents, elders get to go this family friend gets to do this. Everyone, you're remembering everyone's importance and their need to either see or know information or who gives that
Mhm.
information and that gender role where I find a lot of women are told to be the communicators, but the men, the decision makers. But find that the medical staff don't always understand that like not only just thinking about their authority, but like I'm presenting to them, especially if they
Mhm.
are not South Asian themselves. And even when they are, the uniform kind of has a sense of just like, okay, well, if I were to react reactively into emotional, they may give me the wrong thing, the wrong type of service, the wrong type of help because they're
Mhm.
misunderstanding. So I have to like perform for them. So understanding that people are always performing from you to you, no
Mhm.
matter what, not just as a medical person, as a person who's of dominant skin color, um, and that thinking that this is the only way that you'll accept. I can only like I'm what you're walking a fine line to get
Mhm.
the services and then also the respect and understanding and care, and that
Mhm.
people won't forget what you did today. But you
Absolutely.
know,
Yeah.
the clinician might have another patient in an hour. So it's
Yeah.
that kind of like long lasting, like and can you come back and be like, could you say that differently to this person now?
Yeah, do that though, but be outspoken. I did ruffle a lot of feathers in my team, in that I would challenge any physicians who I felt like weren't being very culturally sensitive or sensitive generally, right? So be an advocate, like be firm and be a strong advocate if you feel like there is more and that if our team is missing the mark, it's on us. It's on us to call that out, right? Thank you, Oma. One more question. There's a lot more questions here. Just reading Jocelyn's question. Any tips on supporting people experiencing disenfranchised grief? Oh, I mean, you can start with just simply bringing it up and listening to them because, again, disenfranchised grief is not publicly mourned. It's often invisible. So if you know someone going through disenfranchised grief, whether it is death of someone who they're not close to, or fertility challenges, or you know, death, something related to stigmatizing, just keep talking about it and keep bringing it up with the person that you're supporting because, often they feel like, well, the community's moved on, everyone's moved on, this must not matter. So I know there's lots of questions here, wonderful questions, and I'm happy to continue the conversation in other respects, other mediums, but I know that I have to be respectful of the time and everyone's commitments today. So Brad, I'll leave that to you.
Okay, thank you, Meena, for sharing your knowledge, your experience, and compassion with us this evening. And we truly appreciate the time and care that you put in today's presentation. I'll move my camera so I can talk right into the mic there. And for helping us better understand how culture, connection, and community shape our experiences of grief. And thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. We know there are many ways you could have spent your evening, and we're grateful you chose to be here with us. Before we wrap up, we'll be sharing a few links in the chat, including our webinar feedback survey, a community survey to help guide the future of our Punjabi Grief Initiative, and information about the free grief supports available through the BC Bereavement Helpline. If tonight's conversation brought up anything for you, please know that support is available, and we encourage you to reach out if you need it. On behalf of everyone at the BC Bereavement Helpline, thank you again for joining us this evening. We hope you have a safe and peaceful night, and we look forward to seeing you again at a future webinar. Please take good care. And remember, you don't have to grieve alone. We're here to listen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. And if you're interested in exploring any kind of counseling service, please consider us. I work at Strength Counseling, and we have counselors with every designation all across Canada. And since I was talking about financial barriers, something that really sets us apart as a private practice is the fact that we have a low-cost program. It's a donation program, and so us clinicians are donating our time. So when someone's name comes up on the wait list, we offer them 10 free counseling sessions. Not free, sorry, 10 counseling sessions on a weekly basis at the rate that the client decided is the rate that's within their means. And so that's within our values of providing low-cost services. I hope you consider us at Strength, and please do fill out that survey for BC Bereavement, because we are hoping to fill that gap and provide services for the Punjabi-speaking South Asian clients who are grieving. And thank you again for coming and being with us here this evening.
Thank you all. Good night.
Good night.